problem with the Book of Mormon. Mosiah may very well have created the problem in the Book of Ether without realizing it, because his assumption was, well, I've got the steel sword. Everybody back then had steel swords too. The iron was rusting, but the iron implements in a maca whittle can rust also. See the cultural assumptions we assume as moderns, as opposed to translating ancient texts? We're dealing with a translation, guys and gals. We have to understand what goes into that. By understanding the full implications of the entire Book of Mormon context, as Hamblin has shown, we may not have as big a problem as we think. John L. Sorensen, you just cannot say enough good about what this research guy does. He is phenomenal. I know there are critics on the internet who have found one source that he probably did not understand correctly, and so they've made a big whoop-de-doo, and they say, see, if he's misusing this source, all of his material is no good. He's not credible. You have to be very careful with John Sorensen. Bunk. He missed one source, he misused one source, he misunderstood one source, and of course, they say, well, see, he's so desperate for arguments in favor of the Book of Mormon that he has to misuse his sources. Out of the tens of thousands of sources that he used, if they can find only one, that is an astonishing tribute to John Sorensen. My hat's off to you, Dr. Sorensen. I'll tell you what, this man is phenomenal. He's a Mesoamerican scholar of the first caliber, in my opinion. In his article, Metals and Metallurgy Relating to the Book of Mormon Text, he goes through 211 sources that have to do with metals and metallurgy in the Old World as well as in Mesoamerica. He goes right to the archaeologists and the metallurgists to try to understand what is the context in the ancient world of metallurgy. What extent did the ancients work with metal? What extent is our knowledge of that information? How much of their remaining metalwork have we found? And why don't we find more? He discusses that in this source. It is phenomenal. You can get it from the Neil A. Maxwell Institute, Farms, formerly Farms. You really need to get this paper. I have marked, there is so much to go through. This is going to be really amateur because I'm going to try to find what I've marked so that I can highlight some ideas. I'm not going to go through all 211. I'll make 2 hours of tapes. Pretty phenomenal. In this one source, I'm on page 2. I'm not going to bother taking the time to read every source. A lot of these are in Spanish, and I don't read Spanish very well. I have to confess. That's one language I haven't studied well enough yet. Buenos dias, mi amigos. That's about all I've got. This particular source, the problem of the unknown metal scarcity in medieval written sources, he says there it's relevant to the problem of fixing the technical meaning of an ancient textual term. We still have problems with the linguistics, and this is especially relevant in both Mesoamerican archaeology and the Book of Mormon, as well as in the ancient Mesoamerican texts that we do have that weren't destroyed by the Spanish. This is very interesting. On page 1 of this other source, Ballmuth remarks on the appearance of the earliest coins. This is in studies presented to George M.A. Haufman. As far back as the 3rd millennium B.C., documents comment on metal as an expression of price. The Lydians, it was thought, was the first to create coinage, but theirs was the first bimetallic coinage, not necessarily the first coinage per se. Oh, and the Latin word, they say this, and this is another study. He's got so many studies here, it's phenomenal. It's absolutely breathtaking. He says the Latin word orichalcum and its Greek predecessor designated different metals or different alloys at different times. Did you get that? One Latin word can be translated as different metals depending on what era it's being translated from. That's fascinating. That's very relevant to our Book of Mormon metals. Steel, gold, silver, iron, so on and so forth. Copper. We may not understand what those metals actually were because we're dealing with the translation from an ancient Mesoamerican source. The earliest use of a zinc alloy is at Gezer in Palestine, belonging to the period known as Semitic III. That's 1400 to 1000 BC, and which may be termed a zinc bronze. In another source, by Condon, Steel and Antiquity, a Problem in Terminology, the problem of whether an ancient people had steel is often terminological. That means it depends on what word we're using. That's interesting, isn't it? This has direct relevance to the steel in the Book of Mormon. Pages 24 and 25, they say, in the 3rd millennium BC, smiths in the mountains of Armenia learned to take iron ore from bogs and lakes, and using hearths and bellows bed furnaces, they turned this into a plastic lump or sponge. Hammering then forced out the impurities, resulting in a wrought iron. By 1400 BC, the Armenians had discovered and could reproduce, with varying success, the method of carburizing iron by prolonged heating in contact with carbon, probably the charcoal of their forges. This produced martensite, a thin layer of steel on the exterior of the object. It is best considered semi-steel. By 1000 BC, this process had spread to the Mediterranean. Possibly as early as the 9th century BC, certain tools and possibly weapons were composed of a case-hardened or a carburized iron or semi-steel. But it doesn't mean it's solid steel. It's just layered surface. But a sword or a weapon, an axe, whatever weapon they had, that had that surface would be described as a steel weapon. This is not John Sorensen desperately trying to find anything he can to save the Book of Mormon. He is quoting scholars and archaeologists and their discoveries and their discussions of the linguistic problems we have, as well as the actual problems of finding the remains of the metals. Harriet Crawford, Sumer and the Sumerians, she says on page 131 on metalworking, texts from of early Dynasty I date already distinguish copper and bronze. Oh, this is also interesting. In Robert Forbes' Metallurgy and Antiquity, a notebook for archaeologists and technologists, steel in the authorized version of the Book of the Bible should often be read bronze or copper. On page 435, he says, the northern iron of Jeremiah 15:12 is probably Chaldean steel, and the bright iron taken from the merchants of Dan and Javan may refer to Ionian iron. So it's not direct steel, but they're translating it as that, and yet it's actually bronze, but they're saying it's steel in the Bible. Dennis Heskell, a model for the adoption of metallurgy in the ancient Middle East. Heat-treated metal objects were present at Katal Huyuk in the late 7th and early 6th millennia BC, then were virtually absent for the next 2,000 years. Were you aware of that? That might be one of the problems of why we can't find metal in Mesoamerica, other than the fact that the Spaniards took dozens of tons of gold and silver and copper back with them. Tons. That's how much metal was in Mesoamerica before it was ripped off. That might be one reason why we can't find much. Have you ever thought of that? Some of these Mesoamerican archaeologists say that. Okay, page 28. P.R.S. Muri, Early Metallurgy in Mesopotamia. He says, in historic times, texts indicate that metals were rigorously controlled by the bureaucracy and were regularly recycled. You know, in the scripture it says they will beat their swords into plowshares. They'll take their weapons of war and make other implements of peace.